beyond ecocide. It's really interconnected with all forms of oppression all across the globe. And I hope that this could be the start of a much needed conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. So, David, I think that the fossil fuel component of what's going on in Gaza is really one of the things that's almost never talked about, why it's happening, and the interest that Israel has and the control it has, actually, over the fossil fuel there, and how that is sort of the foundation of the climate crime that's unfolding there. And I wondered if you'd like to expand a little bit more on what Mohammed was saying about that, and really the geopolitical as well as the environmental colonialism that's going on to control those resources, and why the US and the UK has such strong interest in supporting Israel's genocide.
Sure. Honestly, I think you've just summed up exactly what I would say. But maybe I'll just reinforce the point. I'll steal what you've said and just reinforce it in I suppose, my own words. But look, and actually not my own words. Can I say I think there's a really good pamphlet out right now that Verso have published called "Resisting Erasure," which I think makes this point really, really clearly and tries to put class back into what's going on in Gaza, what's always going on in Palestine. And part of that kind of class struggle is a global struggle. It's a struggle, as you indicated, for geopolitical dominance in the Middle East. And I'll maybe narrow that point down a little bit more, because Israel wouldn't exist in the form that it exists right now unless there was a struggle to dominate and control the Middle East generally. And there is a struggle to control and dominate the Middle East because it's oil rich. Now, that's not to say that's the only thing that's going on, but that's kind of the foundation. So we have to say, actually, if we are in the grip, if the world is in a grip of a fossil fuel economy, and we need to wrestle free from that grip, then Palestine becomes a very, very central struggle, has always been a central struggle, and what's going on right now. But maybe to deepen that point a bit, and I do want to, I know we'll come back to it, because I do want to talk about the case of West Papua in a moment. I know it was mentioned by Jeremy in the introduction, but I think we can say that the form of apartheid in Israel, the form that particular form of colonization, the forms of racism that are institutionalized in Israel, come directly from that need to dominate the geopolitical situation, come directly from the need to uphold a fossil fuel economy. Now, that sounds very reductionist and very simplistic. Obviously, lots of other things are going on within that, but I think we have to recognize that, and that's where probably Greta Thunberg and definitely Mohammed, articulated the complexities of that much better than I do, but I think that's where we have to begin, actually.
Just to sort of interject here, in relation to the fossil fuel question in Gaza, I feel like this is a much longer conversation on the energy sector and its complicity in Gaza. But one of the key things that we need to, especially since you mentioned geopolitics, is the connection between the genocide in the neighboring countries, that being Jordan and Egypt, through the sort of trade of LNG to the European Union. We've seen in 2015 how not the Arab gas pipeline, but the Ashkelon Harish pipeline was reversed to allow Israel to send gas to Egypt, and then Egypt is now sending it to the European Union, and a lot of this is going through the Tamar and Leviathan gas fields, and a lot of it is going through Palestinian waters that the Palestinian Authority in this question did not consent to. So not only is it a sort of violation of consent of Palestinian sovereignty and waters, but it's also continuing to profit during the genocide and off of the genocide, and not only so, but also because this is a divergent away from so-called the era of Russian fossil fuels during 2022. So they divested away from Russian fossil fuels and now are using Israeli and Egyptian fossil, like LNG and gas during the genocide. And also the same applies to the case of Jordan through the Arab gas pipeline. So there are still cases to continue expanding, and this is only more reason for people who care about climate and care about the companies that continue to cause the sort of climate havoc and climate crisis to care about what's happening in Palestine, because not only is it about climate change, it's about the direct violation of consent of people and their sovereignty and so on. So, yeah, sorry.
Great, thank you. There's so many interconnected issues here. I wish we had time to elaborate on it for longer. But Daniéle, I wanted to introduce the other component, obviously, we haven't talked about in my view, which is the central thing to address before we can address the climate crisis, is to address inherent racism around the world. And when we certainly look at where who pays as opposed to who benefits, that's more than obvious. And then there's also the plight of just regular working people. We've seen a tremendous amount of unrest, obviously, in France, especially now, but also in the past, related to climate, in terms of what we're seeing here, which is stealing money for the big fossil fuel industries and nuclear industries away from social services, away from essential needs, away from education, health, and so forth. What's your take on what's been going on in France? It's a sort of two-part question. I'm sorry, but partly the sort of uprising in France and the connection with the stress of climate crisis, and also how important is it, first of all, to tackle the problem of racial discrimination, which seems to underpin all of this.
Thank you very much. I will answer by talking about a recent development in France, which shows, I think, the level of consciousness among activists, but in the wider society, because of the increase in threats to our planet and to the people due to not only climate change, but the complicity of our government into accelerating climate change, and that's I think I would compare it to what many people have done over the past weeks, getting involved in the flotilla movement, because the governments were doing nothing, and then the people decided to take action and go and try to breach the blockade. And what we've seen in France on the climate change movement is new movements of people who decided to take action. And there's been in 2021 the birthing of a movement called Les Soulèvements de la Terre, Earth Uprising, that's what we call it. And it was formed by activists who used to be part of several different movements, especially one against the building of new airport in Notre-Dame-des-Landes, and which succeeded. We actually managed, it took years, we managed to cancel the whole project. And so you have those activists who decided to build a broader movement, which is not an organization per se. It's a collective of different people. They learned from the way the government had been targeting small groups of people, and so they organized accordingly. And it's very interesting because this is a network that includes, of course, climate change issue, but has been also involved in the past year in support of movement against police brutality. And just recently, last week, when we had this movement on September the 10th, calling to block the economy, it's part of the the class struggle that has been happening in France. They were part of it also. So linking with economic issues, with anti-racist issues. So it's very interesting the way they are also combining on the ground tactics and like occupations, blockades, and they're focusing on trying to disable ecocidal infrastructure and building a campaign on the ground locally, which is very important. And I think it shows how a movement that started with just, it's not just because there were massive demonstrations calling for climate change and asking the government to do something, just kept seeing them failing the people and decided, so we're going to do this. And I think it's very inspiring. Also, what has been done on the ground, blending like radical action, as I said, strategic planning, and like reclaiming the land. There have been the big movements they've been involved in was about opposing like mega basin. With we call it that's take away water from agricultural lands, and that's really ecocidal big projects just for the handful of capitalist agro-industrials, and they went onto the fields and they massively and organized many people, and that's also the reason why they've been targeted by the government, who has been labeling them eco-terrorists. Yeah, I think that's a trigger. Okay. So they have been actually labeled eco-terrorists, and I think it's interesting how it's the same language, the so-called war on terror that has been used to justify all the past imperialist attacks on people all over the world, and also part of the argument that is being used against the Palestinian people and focusing on Hamas and so on and so forth. So you see how the government is using the same tactics against our movements, and the way the people have been opposing it is supporting actually the movement, because the government tried to ban les soulèvements de la terre, and in response they got huge support from, and it actually helped to grow the movement very much. So I think it's an example of fighting back against governments that are not just not doing anything, but are like accelerating climate change and the way it connects with not only national issue but international issue, and the way our movement is learning from that and connecting the dots, and also so taking part, like this movement is taking part, as I said, anti-racist movement in solidarity with Palestine. So this new cultural struggle, I think, is very hopeful for us.
Thank you. I think it's interesting what you say about the more they try to ban us, the bigger we become, and we've certainly seen that here with the effort against Palestine Action. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that out loud, or whether they're going to haul me away now, but anyway, it's the same thing, that each time they arrest some, more come back. But I think you also raise a very interesting point. And Jason, I just want you to know I haven't forgotten about you up there on the screen. I'm sort of going to circle through and come back to you at the end, because I think you have something very important to say that can wrap up what we're talking about before we go to questions. But this whole idea of stamping out resistance, David, I want you to sort of return to West Papua in particular, and the use of ecocide as a way to wipe out resistance. That if we destroy everything around you in the environment, that'll completely undermine any possibility of resistance amongst indigenous people. And what we tend to forget, I think, about somewhere like West Papua is that what happens there doesn't just affect them, it also affects us around the world in making climate change worse. So could you give us a little bit more detail about the situation there and why it's so important to be supportive of the struggle there?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I will, but can I very, very quickly just respond to what Daniéle said, because I think this overlapping of struggles that's going on right now is really crucial here as well, because the struggle against prescription of Palestine Action, you're allowed to say prescription of Palestine Action if you're not allowed to. But the struggle against the prescription of Palestine Action is being led partly by people who were in the climate movement. So Defend Our Juries is an organisation that was established, set up to support climate protesters. And actually, if we look at the kind of the roots of some of those organisations, they have common roots. This is not just happening now, but there's a really powerful bringing together of the climate movement and the Palestine solidarity movement right now that I just wanted to kind of say that in a moment where we feel like things are being a bit divided and maybe we're being weakened, that strikes me as being a very, very strong front at the moment of unity. So just to say that, you can clap if you agree or not. So yeah, that was a vanity clap. Sorry. Getting back to this, the serious point and the point that Linda's asking. Look, it's obvious in West Papua, and I am partly here going to kind of. There's a booklet that the Centre for Climate Crime and Climate Justice just produced on the British companies who are profiting from West Papua, which is in the heart of the third biggest rainforest area in the world after Amazon and Congo basins. So that's available on the stall, and if you want to know more about that, Hassani from the West Papua, from Free West Papua is there to talk about it. But if you're in West Papua and you're resisting state violence, you're also resisting the mode of industrial development, and you're also resisting the destruction of the rainforest. There's no division between the two. It's obvious. It might not be so. It only becomes obvious in moments of conflict in other places, but that's what the mode of resistance is. The mode of resistance is an anti-capitalist movement, which doesn't necessarily explicitly call itself environmentalist, but it is. It's about the protection of the rainforest from predatory capitalism. Now that's kind of, those links are just self-evident if you're there. But I also kind of, the thing that's also self-evident is the point we were making before. The form of racism that people experience in West Papua is industrial. And the reason I say that is because the way that both the stereotyping and the targeting and the extrajudicial killings and the massacres that go on are based upon a racist ideology, which is about primitiveness. It's about the propensity of Papuans to violence, and all of those things. But the very specific techniques, racist techniques that are used by the state are arising from that mode of industrial exploitation. That's very, very, very obvious there as well. It's not so obvious to us. What are the links that we need to make? The links that we need to make is that, first of all, British companies and shareholders in British companies are major benefactors. That's what we've shown. But also just the rainforest. If this rainforest goes, it really is, and I take in Jason's point, it's an uneven distribution of effects. But we're screwed if this rainforest goes. West Papuans are standing up and are taking their struggle to a brutal state on our behalf. Actually, we have to recognise that. And not only that, but the riches come back through the City of London. The riches from West Papua largely fuel a financialised model, by the way, which is increasing the gap between rich and poor here, because it means that the financial fraction of financial capital gets stronger in British institutions, and that means it weakens the working class. And therefore, I know we don't have enough time to talk about that, but there is a real solidarity between the fortunes of the British working class and what goes on, not just in West Papua, but on in the rest of the world. And I'm not denying that, of course, the riches that have accrued from a whole history of capitalism haven't benefited British society generally, but they are applied in a way that is also affecting the way that we can resist financialization, privatization in this country. So, sorry, that's a very long answer, but West Papua's anti-capitalist movement has to be our anti-capitalist movement as well. It has to be, because the same conditions that are oppressing and repressing the West Papuans are limiting our capacity to resist and to exert some autonomy over our lives. And that's how I would respond to that.
I think that really speaks to the issue of self-determination as well, which we've talked about a lot in terms of these countries, that they don't, the rights on how resources are used in the Congo should belong to the Congolese and not to multinational corporations who are there to plunder and to trigger a genocide, which obviously is huge there. I mean, more than 6 million people dead since 1996, and largely over mineral rights. And I think that sort of brings us to this uncomfortable place as well about what we do instead, because obviously we know that even with our desire for renewable energy, that also comes with plunder and extraction and colonialism and racism. So we've got to be really mindful of how we go forward. And Mohammed, I think, in Gaza, what was one of the more shocking things I think I read about what you sent me in advance was, again, the connection between the control that Israel has over everything in terms of resources, and even over potentially so-called climate solutions. And that one of the projects that you sent me was something called Stardust Solutions, which is ostensibly solar, but in fact probably, as you suggested, deeply tied to the military, and includes controlling the weather and seeding, things like seeding clouds. And it actually reminded me of in 1986, when the Chernobyl nuclear disaster happened in Ukraine, and obviously there was a big cloud of fallout, which we know went very far and wide, including over Europe. But as this cloud set off, President Gorbachev ordered the Russian Air Force to seed the cloud so that the predominant fallout would fall not on Moscow, but on Belarus. So Belarus was deliberately targeted to take the biggest dose, and it's in fact where the largest radioactive fallout from that disaster still is. So, Mohammed, could you talk a little bit about that project, and also, that this is sort of presented as some sort of solar climate positive thing, but is in fact yet another example of how the Palestinian people, they have no say in anything, including so-called mitigation on climate.
The weaponization of the weather has been something that has been sort of described in the past, as you said, in the 1960s, but even with the Vietnam War, where it has been used by the US and by many other parties. Now, more recently, what we've seen is how Palestine has become a laboratory. Now, on sort of Stardust Solutions or solar geoengineering experiments in general, we've seen make sunsets, and we've seen other projects across the globe in the US and else sort of manifesting into colonial or neo-colonial projects. They're greenwashed techno-fixes because of the way that they are often implemented. A lot of the times they're theorized and sort of developed in the global north, but then implemented in the global south. At the moment, there's Stardust Solutions, for example, which is funded, or at least led by AWZ Ventures, and AWZ Ventures is situated in Silicon Valley. Their board of directors has one former director of MI5, one deputy director from the FBI, one former director from FBI, MI5, and the CIA, as well as former Prime Minister of Canada. Now, they're also funded by the Israeli Defense Fund, and that just, one would question, why are those people funding a false or a so-called climate solution and not anywhere but in Gaza or in Palestine? More recently, what has happened was Janos Pastor, a well-known figure in the sort of climate realm, came out with a report on behalf of Stardust Solutions. He worked as a consultant for them, then sort of came out saying that, oh, actually all the sort of gains or all the monetary benefits I've gained from this project, I've donated to UNRWA. Mind you, he's written a report to guide Stardust Solutions to continue their experimentations in Gaza. And the way that it's been done is that Stardust Solutions, or solar geoengineering in general, as a climate solution, happens in two ways. One is through indoor experimentation, which is usually safer, and the other is through outdoor experimentation, which might be as well an assault to sovereignty and an assault to indigenous people and land. What has happened in Gaza so far is outdoor experiments that are low altitude, quote unquote, according to Janos Pastor, which is already a threat to humanity in Palestine and a threat to the land. The reason that is so is because, one, it's not a false climate solution. It's stratospheric aerosols that are injected into the air that we don't know what they do, and that's why they're a false climate solution. We don't know how bad they could influence the weather. We don't know how bad they could completely cover our stratosphere in ways that are supposedly meant to reflect sunlight. But for now, the key question is, why are these intelligence folk and why is the military industry and the larger military industrial complex in the US investing in it? We've contacted people from Job Site News, Anthony Lowenstein, Andreas Malm, etc. And there should be a book and a chapter of it coming out on October 7 in a few weeks. A lot of the work that we do as well at the Palestinian Institute for Climate Strategy covers the same topics. On an alternative note, besides solar geoengineering, what I wish to inject here and to really get all of us starting to talk about is the idea of climate reparations and the larger military industrial complex in relation to climate change and climate justice. The key question here is why should we care? How does it fit into the larger reparations framework? Recent reports, especially one that we've worked on in collaboration with Tipping Point North-South, shows that $150 billion in reparation is owed to Palestinians, primarily by Israel and primarily by Germany and then the UK and the US and allies. The key thing to look into here is that reparations has to be covered from all aspects of harm and all sort of forms of displacement, but also in particular climate and military emissions that have been caused from the countless wars and genocides and slow violence in Gaza and Palestinian land. So I'll leave it here, but I just also want to end it from my part on this note, and it's that this did not, again, start on October 7, and it did not start in 2005 or even 1948. The energy infrastructure in at least Palestine, for example, in Yafa and Haifa and Tulkarem, started in 1920 with Phineas Rutenberg, a Russian Zionist, bringing electricity, creating the infrastructure for a Zionist Jewish state. What that allowed for is the establishment of a logic of coloniality, a logic of occupation. We saw how Palestinian forms of living, of agriculture, of building, of transportation has been completely thrown to the side when electricity and energy was unequally distributed, where 80% of electricity was given to 20% of the population. I'm saying this because this manifests into how energy dynamics and power dynamics are created today. And this is just one way of looking into inequality and looking into occupation, not just in Palestine, but across the globe. The UK is very much a society of petroculture that manifests in so many different ways, even in this room. And we're all complicit in the genocide just right now by being here one way or another. So this asks for a reinterpretation of how we see things and how we live and how we must continue cutting off our ways of complicity. And the Francesca Albanese report that came out a month and a bit ago is a great way to start. But this is just a way to begin an inquiry as to how climate change is really interlinked and very entrenched into the logic of occupation and coloniality, but then also how our daily lives and how we run our activities is also complicit. Thank you.
So I'm going to wrap up with two last questions, one for you, Daniéle, and one for Jason, which focus perhaps more on, where do we go from here? Because it does seem very insurmountable. And I think I've read somewhere, Daniéle, maybe it was said to you in an interview, where they said, you are right, but what you want is impossible. And I think, we wouldn't be sitting here, obviously, if we thought it was impossible, but it does feel impossible sometimes. And I'm going to sort of ask a similar question to you, Jason, about this as well. But I wonder, Daniéle, where do you see the possible in terms of turning a corner on this? Because there are so many challenges, so many complex issues involved with this. Do you see some way forward? Perhaps it's the civilian uprisings and the ZADs and so forth in France. So tell us a little bit more about what you think.
Yeah, I would say I see a way forward through the experience of the communities that are resisting both imperial, capitalist, and ecocide. I wanted to give two examples of that link question of climate change and human rights and racism. there's been a study in France about the location of 1,500 officially traveler reception areas, and they compared them to pollution sources such as waste disposal sites, major highways, and very dangerous classified industrial facilities. And they found that these sites are not only in already exposed areas, they are constantly placed within the most polluted zones of those municipalities, which means what we've been talking about with this divide between global north and global south. I think it's important to see how it reverberates also within the global north, and how there's vulnerable communities that are targeted by capitalism and by climate change, and they are already vulnerable, and that's the case for the traveler. I don't know if you say gypsies in the UK communities in France. And what has been happening over the past year is that they have been organizing around these issues. There's a group of mainly women in the north of France that decided to fight back against their living conditions and the fact that they have been subjected to pollution and also the place that are by law, the towns are by law obligated to give them, electricity, energy, clean water, and a lot of the municipality don't do that and let them in those very polluted areas and stuff. And this group has been organizing and fighting back. And the first thing also, what is important is that they've been asking left movements and climate change movements to take their demands into account, because especially when you think about anti-Tsiganism, which is the racism against Romani and travelers and stuff like. In France, it's one of the most profound racism, most structural racism, and even on the left, we are not really that much involved in supporting those people, not enough. So it was also a wake-up call for us when those people organized and said, okay, you're supposed to be, on the side of the oppressed and all that, but we're here. You don't even see us. You don't see what we've been experiencing. So I think that's for me. It's a great example that the other one I want to talk about is also it's also a legacy of French imperialism and colonialism, because it's been happening in the West, French West Indies. It's a big scandal, health and climate and environmental issue about a pesticide called chlordécone that has been used in banana plantations. It's also a legacy of colonialism in Martinique and Guadeloupe, the French West Indies, that the economy is built around, those plantations. And it's a very dangerous pesticide that means that cause cancer and a lot of disorder in people, and also it's stays in the environment for centuries, like literally centuries. So this pesticide had been banned since the 1970s. We knew that it was dangerous, but they kept using it because the big bosses of the plantation had bought them and they wanted to use it. So it's a disaster, but it's been barely talked about in France, in continental France, because of racism toward the population there. But the people over there mobilized more and more. And what has been happening over the past year, especially, is now we have a movement in France against pesticide, because the government want to reintroduce a pesticide in France, in continental France. And so the people in the West Indies and involved in those movements came and say, okay, so we've been having this problem for like decades. Nobody cared, but now you see that this is happening to you, because they were able to do that to us. And they got away with that, and now they feel free also to target, mostly white population in continental France. So now you got this movement that is quite big against the reintroduction of this pesticide in France, and bridges being built between the movement against chlordécone in the French West Indies and the movement that is happening now around this other pesticide. And to me, it's also very important to see this as a way forward, like connecting our fight, our struggle, who are similar, and to understand that if we let the most vulnerable communities targeted and poisoned and subjected to racism and ecocide, we will suffer it sooner or later. And nowadays it's sooner and sooner now. So those to me are like example of how we need to build those connected. They are connected in the way the system is targeting us. So we have to connect our fight, and I think that's a good foundation for fighting back and winning.
Very good, thank you. So Jason, I'm going to give you the last word, and I want to focus a little bit on economic democracy, what you've talked about as the way forward, because it seems to me that in wrestling back the control of production away from capitalism and the capitalist imperialism and corporations, we've suddenly entered also an era where we're seeing really rampant energy greed in the form of AI and the data centers, and a choice that it seems unimaginable under a climate crisis, that we would now go down a path with something that requires even more energy when we should in fact be reducing our consumption. So can you elaborate a little bit on your thoughts on a way forward? How do we get out of that system? How do we change it so that it in fact becomes equitable and just?
Yeah, thanks, Linda. And can I confirm you can hear me all right? You can. Okay, great. So yeah, I enjoyed what the panelists had to say. I thought it was really rich. I'm trying to think of what I can add here. But what I'm going to do is kind of explain briefly why I think it is that we have to understand the climate crisis as an effect of capitalism, like 100% a problem of the system of production, driven by capitalism, and it's capitalism that's preventing us from addressing it. Now, to me, this is something that's frequently said on the left, but I feel is not often specified well enough. Like why is it exactly that capitalism poses these obstacles to us, and what does that mean for the way forward? I think that when people hear the word capitalism, they often think of things like markets and businesses and trade. But I think it's important to understand that those things they pre-existed capitalism by thousands of years. They're innocent enough on their own. They take in many different forms. What distinguishes capitalism from other economic systems is that it's fundamentally undemocratic, right? Now, and that's true for even those of us who live in political democracies. When it comes to the economic system, the system of production, which we are all engaged in every day of our lives, it's fundamentally undemocratic. Not even a shadow of democracy is allowed to enter, right? Under capitalism, production is controlled by capital, by which I mean the big commercial banks that guide investments, the major corporations that control the means of production, and the 1% who own the majority of investable assets, right? They're the ones that determine how to use our labor, how to use our productive capacities, what to invest in, what to produce, et cetera, et cetera. The workers, those of us who are actually doing the production, do not get a say in how our own productive capacities are used, right? And for capital, it's crucial to understand the purpose of production is not to meet human needs or to achieve any ecological goals of any kind. The purpose is to maximize and accumulate profit. That's it. That's the system we live in, right? Now, the result of this is that it leads to perverse forms of production. We get massive overproduction of things like fossil fuels and SUVs and private jets and mansions and weapons, right? Because these things are highly profitable to capital, but we get chronic underproduction of obviously necessary things like renewable energy, public transit, affordable housing, regenerative agricultural food, etc. Because these things are obviously much less profitable to capital or not profitable at all, right? So this is what leads to the totally absurd paradox that we currently live under, where in a country like Britain, let's say, we have massive levels of aggregate production to the point of blowing past planetary boundaries and driving ecological breakdown on a planetary scale, and yet we at the same time have massive human deprivation, right? What explains this paradox is that control of the production is in the hands of capital. Now this is extremely clear when it comes to the question of the energy transition. Okay, we know what we need to do. We must scale down fossil fuel production, and we need to increase the transition to renewables. Okay, but it's not happening. And why is it not happening, given the fact that there is mass popular will, and we know exactly what to do? It's because fossil fuels are 3 to 4 times more profitable than renewables. And so capital keeps investing in fossil fuels and makes totally inadequate investments in renewable transition, even while the world burns around us, right? I mean, just recently, BlackRock and other major investment firms, which hold trillions of US dollars in terms of investment power, came out and said explicitly that they are abandoning their commitment to climate investments because it's not profitable enough, right? I think this has to be a very clear wake-up call to us that this transition is not going to happen as long as capital is in control of investments, okay? And the same thing is true, not just when it comes to energy, but all the other forms of production that are at stake here. We have to scale down production of SUVs and data centers, for example, right? Mansions and so on. Capital is not going to do that because it will not scale down any form of production that is profitable to it. And we have to increase things like public transit, but capital is not going to do that, you know, or insulate buildings because these are not profitable activities, okay? So if we agree here that the main problem here is that capitalism is anti-democratic, then I think we have to see the solution as economic democracy, right? Extend the principle of democracy into the realm of production so that we can democratically determine how our labor and our productive capacities, our planet's resources, should be used and for what purposes, right? In other words, socialism. And we can talk about what concretely that would look like, and I think that being concrete is actually quite crucial here. So I would say, if I was just to limit it to a few very brief things, we would need a public finance institution which can make the necessary investments in things like renewables and public transit and regeneration, et cetera, totally regardless of the question of profitability, right? That's crucial. We have to have that. It's non-negotiable. We also need a credit guidance framework which can impose rules on the commercial banks and major financial firms that will limit their investments in destructive forms of production, right? Quantitatively limit those investments while requiring them to increase investments in socially and ecologically necessary forms of production, okay? And then finally, I would say we need to nationalize key sectors like the energy sector and the public transit sector so that production in these sectors can be brought in line with social and ecological objectives. Whereas as long as they're under the control of capital, this cannot occur, right? And so, like, basically I want to emphasize here this important fact. People will often say, like, you know, the climate crisis is intractable, very difficult to solve. It'll take us generations, you know, 1.5 degrees is impossible, and, you know, like hitting 3 degrees is inevitable at this point because the system has so much inertia, et cetera. All of this is false. All of this is lies. The climate crisis is extremely easy to solve. We know exactly what to do. We have more than enough productive capacity to do it. We can deal with the problem in an extremely short period of time, right? Ending human deprivation and achieving our ecological objectives at the same time. But it cannot happen under capitalism. It cannot happen under capitalism. It will not. And I think it's clearly going to require democratic control over the means of production. And the sooner we recognize that that is a precondition for successful green transition, the better off we will be. And I will add briefly here, for the Global South, this is going to require, as somebody mentioned earlier, a struggle for national liberation so that they can control their own resources and policy trajectory. Now, once we understand this fact, I think it becomes clear that, you know, the kind of movement that we're going to need is more than just a movement that can mobilize protests, albeit these are extremely important, but rather one that can actually succeed in uniting a mass of the population together, bridging the climate movement with working class communities, addressing their concerns, building a political party that can win elections and implement the necessary transformations, right? I think that has to be the core of our agenda, because without that, I seriously believe that we cannot do it. And so I think for this, you know, we need a completely different narrative than the one that the green movement has so far, the dominance, let's say, the mainstream green movement has so far given us. the mainstream narrative has been something like, the ecological crisis is a result of overconsumption, therefore we have to address our individual behavior, and so it becomes a kind of politics of guilt. Instead, what we need is something much more radical, right? A narrative built around the fact that we are the producers. We are the ones that produce all of the wealth of the nation. But right now, we do not have control over our own means of production, right? We're prevented from doing what we know needs to be done, prevented from addressing basic social and ecological needs. We are hostage to capital, right? And so therefore we need to regain control over production. And when we do that, then we can solve our ecological and social crises in a short period of time. A narrative like this that centers workers and ordinary people not as objects of guilt, but as agents of radical transformation that can achieve the objectives that we need.
So we're going to go to questions now. I know we started a bit late, so I'm looking around to see if I can get the nod to overrun a little bit, so we use all of our time. But we'll do what we did before, which is we always start on the left. That's probably good. My left. We'll start over here with a couple of, let's try just 2 questions from each section first to see how we do, because we are a bit low on time. So we'll take 2 questions. I do urge you 2 things, one of which is to make it a question. Take advantage of our panel here to ask them something rather than a statement, if you don't mind, and also to keep it really as concise as possible so that we give everybody who wants to a chance to ask in the time we have left. And Charlotte's going to come around with this microphone and we'll see if, so we'll look for some hands on this side. I see a gentleman in the back, I see a light shine, a young woman in the middle there, so the 2, do you see them at the top? Let's start with those 2.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm part of France Insoumise as well. So thank you, Daniel, for coming. And I believe we're a left populist movement. And my broader question is, how do we make environmentalism populist and popular? As in, is there any campaign that particularly worked recently that you have in mind? Because the problem I see sometimes when I'm canvassing, when I'm door knocking, is that a lot of people believe that there's a sort of like globalist green agenda to, control people. Like, for example, like they don't want us to eat meat because meat is like muscle, and if you don't have muscle, you can't make the revolution, this sort of thing. I'll give another example that's very concrete. I'm going to
ask you actually not to give any more examples because we really need to keep the questions short. I think you've made your point, so we'll take that and move on. Sorry.
Mario from Belgium. David referred to the creation of Israel for the interest and control of resources in the region. Also, Mohammed referred to that for the Stardust project and so on. Can we also consider that the choice of going for a genocide today in Gaza is linked to the gas reserves in front of the beach, or is that not a link?
There was a young woman up in the middle there. Yeah.
My question is really simple. But before I go into that, can I just say I found the whole thing about 2048 really disheartening. We need change to happen real quick. So my question is, what 3 tips can the panel offer this audience that we can start exercising individually, collectively from tomorrow? 3 tips, please, that we can all do beginning tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. So I don't know, Daniéle, if you want to address the populism, how to make have you had any success with something that's made climate popular and populist?
Well, I don't know if it's a good example, but I think it's the one I'm going to talk about is a way how we don't make climate change anti-people. And this is a debate in France between us. We call ourselves, I mean, we are a Green Party, but a radical one, which means that we think that we need to be anti-capitalist if we want to face climate change, or else it's more like, gardening and stuff like that. It has to be to focus to the core. So it's a debate between us and our colleagues on the Green Party in France about, I don't know how you say in English, about local low emission, zone of low emission. I don't know if you, yeah, it's the same term. It's a area in cities that forbids some cars, and they're trying to implement it in France, and the problem being that it will affect mostly working class people and people living, for instance, I live in Paris, all the people living around Paris and outside of Paris, they need actually their cars to get in the city and to work. And we've said that the idea of low level emission zone are good ideas, that because we have to lower emissions, but it has to be implemented at the same time we provide public transport. We provide alternative means for the people, because or else it will mean that people who can afford not to have a car, for instance, I do live inside Paris, where I don't need a car because I live inside Paris, but a lot of people can afford that. And so we said we need to make, we need to make a pause into implementing those zones, because we have to make sure that the people will be affected. We can't afford to live without a car, have alternative means. And I think it's very important, especially because that's a focal point for the far right. They've been campaigning on that issues in order to win over working class people. And I don't know if you've been following what has been happening in France over the past years. There has been this big Yellow Vest movement who started and who centered around the fact that people were living in places where they needed a car, and they actually mobilized against the rising price of gas. So I think my example was to show that we need to be there also to say that environmental issues are not anti-working class people, or else the far right will win them over. And I think it's the best way to campaign for public transport and stuff like that if we are consistent in also supporting working class people.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Wasn't sure if this is on. So I'm going to just ask which of you would like to answer maybe a couple of the other questions. Please keep your answers concise so we can get to the next questions, though. There was one about the gas reserves off the coast of Razan, and Jason, you'll have to sort of shout and interrupt us if you want to answer, since you're not sitting here. Just let us know if there's one of those questions you want to answer. And then there were the 3 tips, which I think, we'll take one each maybe, or we'll get to 3, but don't do 3 each, because we don't have time.
I was going to respond to that by answering the first and the third question in the same way. The successes are the 3 things, if that's
sounds
okay.
Brilliant. Go ahead.
But very quickly on gas, look, I think on the Levant field and on the gas off Gaza, it's very clear to me that what Israel is doing is using that gas to integrate itself further into the Middle Eastern economy, and particularly the Middle Eastern energy economy it's exporting to Egypt. It's using that to cultivate relations with other Arab states. Mohammed might say more to me than that. And that's part of the geopolitical manoeuvring that's going on. Is it a motivation for the genocide? I don't think I don't think we need to go down that route, to be honest. It's strengthening Israel in particular ways, which strengthens its ability to do that. Three successes, three things. I'm going to try and be a little bit even more concrete than Jason, because I agree with Jason. We have to be concrete, but I'm going to be a little bit more concrete. What do we do in the here and now before we build the social capacity to do the kinds of things that Jason's talking about? First of all, ULEZ, someone in the crowd mentioned ULEZ, which is our low emissions programme in London. I think the politics of that were handled disastrously. I actually feel sorry for people who have vehicles that they rely on to work in that were frozen out of that economy, because my solution is not to impose those restrictions unless we tax the polluters. We have to tax the polluters to make sure that everyone gets a van. Never mind gets £2,500 to subsidise a van that's going to cost £20,000. So that's the kind of agitation that we need, and to undermine the reform claim that what we're dealing with is a liberal elite, things imposed from above by a liberal elite, because actually, to some extent, it is in those terms, but it doesn't have to be. That's the first thing. The second thing, we empower workers, because when workers are empowered in their workplace, they are able to slow down their work, to de-intensify their work. The climate catastrophe is being accelerated literally because work is intensifying everywhere across the world, and we don't talk about it in those terms. When workers are in unions, they're able to demand shorter working week. When workers have got national bargaining, they're able to do that. When workers are organised in their workplaces, they can slow down and de-intensify production. We don't think about it in climate terms, but we empower workers and we strengthen unions. That gives us the tools to be able to de-intensify work. And that is happening in a lot of industries. Third, public ownership. There's a big discussion right now. The Starmer government, people are surprised that Starmer government keeps talking about criminalising water bosses or criminalising or sending bosses to jail. We have to be very careful about that, because what that is an excuse not to bring water into public control, and that will be going on in a lot of other industries. No, there are 70 to 80% of the British people who want water in public control. We can say, instead of fining Thames Water 100 million, we take shares. We take £100 million worth of shares from Thames Water, we put it in public control, and that will be popular, and it's a realistic demand. And that begins to weaken the capitalist structures that are shoring up this mess that Jason was talking about, and prepare us for a more revolutionary change that we clearly need. Thank you.
I just wish to add on the point that is Israel's intent towards having the genocide in Gaza committed and still ongoing for the gas fields. I wish to say that that's just a minimization of the conflict and the genocide and the war. It all really started hundreds of years ago. I mean, I think we have to call the companies and the countries complicit out. It is British Petroleum who, when we talk about integrating the economy in the Middle East, that started in Iran initially in 1901, then sort of pressured and urged by Churchill to invest into these oil companies and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which then later on expanded into the Kirkuk sort of region in Iraq, and then Haifa, creating the Kirkuk-Haifa pipeline. Now, this all manifests today into what I referred to earlier as the sort of techno-capitalist point. The accumulation of both capital in the region is part of, the same way we've seen not only capital accumulation, but also technological accumulation, or just simply this displacement of emissions, displacement of technology, pushing away what sort of innovation comes from the global north to the global majority as a way to let the harm reside in the Middle East. That's what we're seeing now, where, for example, Tel Aviv has most sort of surveillance companies in the military-industrial complex manifesting there in a way that it has to be protected by national interest of the British, of the US, and so on. And this is not just now. We've seen it in 1950s, where the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, when there were attempts to have it be nationalized by the Iranian leaders at the time were just simply moved out. So that there were attempts of resistance of these, forms of self-determination and nationhood and sovereignty by people in the region, by the Iranians, by the Palestinians, by the Iraqis. But at the moment, we've seen how conflict is created and manufactured, how consent is manufactured to genocide people. So this is part of the issue we see today. And this is all a climate justice issue, by the way, just to let you all know that this is what we need to recognize and resist in the imperial core as people who live in the West. And Wael Dahdouh said something just very recently about how the West and the Western media has completely neglected Palestinians and allowed Palestinians to be the only people who are currently resisting these systems and resisting the fire in Gaza. So this is really a call to action for everybody to first politically educate your communities and yourselves as well, to think about how is it that you're complicit, and just keep this in mind as to how it's all really connected. And as Jason really mentioned, capitalism is really the curse of the world at the moment. We can solve most problems if we do rid ourselves of these capitalist societies and capitalist forms of petroculture and culture. Thank you.
Jason, do you want to address any of those questions, or shall we move on to the next one?
I'm happy to move on, yeah. Those are nice responses.
All right, so we're going to take probably at this point one question. I see a hand up there, and then one question up there. So there's only one here, I think. It's right there. Oh, there's one here. Oh, there's one down here. You asked a question. You asked a question earlier. I remember you. So we'll take the. Thank you. We'll take the one in the front. She's got a red scarf, and then there was one up there. Right at the back with his hand up.
Thank you so much. This has been an amazing panel and really, really helpful. My question is, you said that we need to think about how we all can be complicit in genocide if we don't resist. And I was looking at the data that in the first 15 months of Israel's bombing of Gaza has produced more CO2 than 100 countries' annual emissions. So this is not just genocide of people in Gaza, this is genocide of people globally through ecocide. So how do we reframe the conversation that we all are victims of this genocide?
Hello, everyone. There are many similarities in criminalization of activism. In France, there is l'écoterrorisme, les gilets jaunes, and it ends up first by targeting them as terrorists, and then you send the police and la gendarmerie, and sometimes they kill people. We have an example of Rémi Fraisse, a young activist in le barrage de Sivens, who was killed by la gendarmerie nationale. And how can we protect activism in general? Because I see this also shifting in the UK. We see how we criminalize, I don't know if I can say it, but Palestine action, and then it will move to all sorts of things. We criminalize, and then we unleash the police, and they go rock and roll and activism. So is there anything we can do to protect more activism?
Thank you. So Jason, I'm just going to ask you if you'd like to answer either of those questions first before we go to the live panelists here.
Okay, yeah. In terms of the question about Palestine, I mean, I think that Mohammed is probably best positioned to answer that. But I can say this: like, I kind of encountered a lot people in the green movements or the climate movements who will try to say that the reason we should care about what's happening in Gaza is because it's also ecocide, right? And this is what connects it to. But to me, this is actually a fairly, I mean, of course it's true, but it's also, I think, a fairly weak argument. I mean, there's many other much stronger reasons we should oppose the genocide. And there's also many other much stronger reasons that we have to understand the connections between these two crises, right? And I think one of those, I would just point to this fact, which is that if we assume that all countries in the world, if we understand that all countries in the world must achieve an ecological transition, right? Leaving aside the fact that this must be driven primarily by transformations in the global north, all countries have to also pursue energy transition, okay? This cannot happen under the current conditions where, say, for example, under World Bank and IMF structural adjustment programs, or under any of the dictatorship of foreign capital that overrides national democracies in the global south, right, determining macroeconomic policy, right, it cannot happen until there is effectively national liberation and economic sovereignty in the global south. When the south controls their own means of production, right, their own labor, and their own resources. That's not the world we live in. That's the world we must achieve. Now, how do you get there? You get there through national liberation struggle, right? And the Palestinian movement is engaged in precisely that. It is a struggle for national liberation, right? And must be understood, therefore, this is the kind of struggle that every person who cares about the climate, right, must back. Because, again, national liberation is the precondition for ecological planning and ecological transition. Simple as that. Now, you can see how the states of the imperial core react very strongly against national liberation in the global south, right? To the point of totally genocidal violence, spitting on their own claims to supporting human rights and international law, right? Why do they do that? They do that because they understand that the capitalist system is a world economy where capital accumulation in the imperial core depends on the subordination of producers in the global south, the subordination of workers and producers in the global south, right? To supply cheap labor and cheap resources for commodity chains that service northern profits, right? National liberation movements threaten that order fundamentally. And that is why every time successful national liberation movements have emerged, they've been brutally crushed. Today it's Palestine, but before it was Libya, before it was Iraq, before it was Vietnam, before it was Indonesia, before it was the Congo, over and over again we see this pattern. The capitalist world economy requires the suppression of national liberation movements, and we, who must resist it for our survival and for humanity, must oppose that, right? Must support national liberation in the South. And so I think that that's the reason. That's the reason that anyone who cares about the climate or anything else should care about the struggle in Gaza.
So would any of you like to just answer those last couple of questions real quickly, and then we'll wrap up?
I want to give some points about the question about how do we protect the movements from state violence and state repression. I think we built big and massive movements. I think our number is the key. The more we are, the less, and the more organized we are, the less they are able to fight us as big we are. And the second thing I would say is to speak out, even if we are not the one targeted at the time. To give an example, before les soulèvements de la terre were the attempt ban on this soulèvements de la terre a couple of years ago, it happened to an organization against Islamophobia in France, the CCIF, who was banned. And at the time, the left didn't say anything because of Islamophobia, even on the left, and all this propaganda that has been happening in France especially, but I think it's happening here also. And the left didn't say and didn't side with them because of the stigma of, being Muslim and stuff. So they were emboldened to do that to other people. So I think, we are stronger and less vulnerable to state repression when we speak out, whenever one of us, even if it's not directly connected to our struggle, but one of the people fighting back are targeted. And the more we are to stand up and speak up and be organized, the better protected we all are, I would say.
Thank you. So just real quick, last couple of comments on the questions.
No, absolutely. I mean, just to address your question in regards to the Guardian article that talks about how in the first 15 months of the genocide, the greenhouse gas emissions amount to those of 100 countries in 1 year. That's a universal crime. I mean, that should be something that matters to everybody in this room. When we said that $150 billion of climate, of reparations coming from military climate sort of conflict emissions, related emissions, is sort of owed to Palestinians and is an issue that Palestinians should care about. That's also how much harm has been caused, not just to Palestinian land, but to the climate crisis or global warming, etc. So there needs to be a narrative rupture. I mean, we've seen how the narrative has changed on climate, especially with Greta Thunberg talking about Palestine, really shifting the whole narrative. But I think there needs to be a attempt to redefine and also politicize the climate justice issue and climate change as a whole. As someone who has been to the sort of UNFCCC multilateral negotiations, it's really a load of rubbish just because of the fact that we continue speaking about the technical, completely neglecting stories, lived experiences, the qualitative data. And even when we talk about quantitative data, it's very much greenwashed. So I hope, since we don't have much time, we're coming out with an ecological justice manifesto under the Palestinian Institute for Climate Strategy, which has a huge campaign coming the next few weeks, months, and hopefully the next few years as well. So please stay tuned, read the manifesto. We're going to have a webinar in a week. We're going to do a lot of work to socialize it and redefine what climate justice means and redefine the movement slowly and surely so that we can also have, again, the imperial core resisting from within and hopefully support the Palestinian cause and the struggle against Israeli militarism, genocide, imperialism, and capitalism. Thank you very much.
On protecting activists, I'm not saying that workers' organisation is the solution to everything, but I think there's a lot more that can be done in bringing the labour workers' organisations and particularly trade unions into this. And I'll give you one example. The current criminalisation of climate protesters, less so of Palestine solidarity protesters, but of climate protesters, is largely based upon the disruption to national infrastructure, which was a new offence, which was introduced by the Tories and is supported by the Starmer government, and in fact things have intensified. Now, when there was a dispute over minimum service provision, I don't know if people remember this, but it was going to severely restrict the rights of trade unions to take action. It was on exactly the same basis, the disruption to national infrastructure. So that's one example of where that common ground is actually there between workers' organisations and protesters on the streets. And I think that the Unite motion, if anyone's a member of Unite here or knows about this, there was a motion in the trade union Unite. Unite organises workers in some of the arms factories that have been blockaded. And their union leadership was supporting the right of those workers to continue working in the face of protest, primarily. And that vote of the conference has overturned that. I'm not saying but symbolically that's very important because it says, no, we can support workers' rights, but we also have to support the protesters who are trying to bring down an infrastructure which is supporting a genocide. So I think that's partly the answer to that question. Very last point on Jason's point on struggles of national liberation. There is a struggle of national liberation that we've mentioned here. That is partly a political struggle. It's partly an armed struggle. It's going on in West Papua right now. And one of the things that struggle is aiming to do is to get rid of British capital and international capital, to get rid of BP in Tanggu Bay, ruining one of the world's most important areas of biodiversity. And by the way, this is it's kind of making the point about Gaza, but in a different way. BP in Tanggu Bay, the amount of carbon that will be produced in the expansion of that facility will effectively wipe out. It's the equivalent of all of the EU's emissions reductions between 2015 and 2030. Now, if that struggle for national liberation in West Papua wins, then they have a chance of preventing the expansion of that facility. If it doesn't, they don't. And that reinforces the point that a lot of this stuff can be won through international solidarity. We have to build in our own workplaces, in our own communities, of course, but we need to do it in ways that make international campaigns and national liberation struggles effective, and then we try and redress the balance and again, weaken those structures of global capitalism that have to be fatally weakened.
big thank you to our wonderful panel this afternoon and for all of you for sticking around. Let's give them a quick round of applause. We are going to take a short break. There is one more session. Please stay for that. There are books outside. Please browse the booths there, the poetry books there for purchase. There are other pamphlets and information tables, so please take a good look at those. Buy a book and come back in 15 minutes.
Okay, everybody, welcome for the final panel, but not the final session of the day, because afterwards we'll have a video conversation between two of our speakers that weren't able to come in conversation with Jeremy, and a few more words from him. And then, as you can see above, without the address, but, as we will be discussing on this panel, we all have these sort of internet phone things that tell us where to go and what to do and have some insidious control over us, but also they can be useful. And one of the ways they're useful is the map. So the George, which is very close by, I can't remember what road it is on, I think it's on Commercial Road or Commercial Street. one of those, don't go to the wrong one, don't blame me, sorry, where there'll be music and a gig and it's fun and it's very nice. And upstairs is peculiar, I'm told, if you like that sort of thing. I don't know what that sort of thing is. You can find out. So today, now, we're going to talk about not just the media landscape, but also how that relates to digital platforms, data, and artificial technology. And I don't know why, but when I was thinking how to present this on the way here, I kept thinking of Jello Biafra and the Dead Kennedys, which probably won't mean anything to anyone. Oh, there we go, brilliant. And the Dead Kennedys have a song from, I think, 1976 called California Uber Alles, which is about Jerry Brown, who was governor at the time, and saying what a threat he was and so on. And then there's a new version when Reagan becomes president, which is, we've got a real problem now. And I feel like that's where we are with the media and communicative landscape. We know that we had big problems with billionaire-owned TV and print media. We'll hear about some of those problems today, but they have been deepened and extended with not just billionaire control, but centre billion, is that a word? Soon to be trillionaire controlled mega platforms and artificial intelligence shaping the things that we see. So we've got a wonderful and varied platform for you of speakers, not platform in the things that make us scroll to death, for you today to not only talk about the problems, but to talk about some hope, some solutions. And the format that we're going to have is each of the speakers, who don't need any introduction, but I will introduce them because I'm contractually obliged to, will each speak. I'll ask them all a question and they'll all speak for a bit. Then we'll discuss amongst ourselves for a bit. And then we'll have questions from you all in the room and you watching online as well. So if you put your questions into the chat, Artin or some other very clever person will find some mechanism to get them from you to me, and we'll also ask those and hear from our panel. So to very briefly introduce people who need no introduction, we have Peter Oborne, who, as you all know, is a extremely distinguished and experienced British journalist. He was the chief political commentator at the Daily Telegraph, resigning in 2015, citing ethical concerns over the paper's relationship with its advertisers. He is also a broadcaster. You'll recognise him from Channel 4's Dispatches. He writes wonderful cricket books and does very much more. We have joining us online, Amy Goodman, very familiar face from Democracy Now! And judging by that reception, I don't need to say anything more about her. You all know her very well. You're very familiar with the War and Peace report every morning. Welcome, Amy. We have with us at the end of the panel there, Ashira Darwish, who is a Palestinian trauma therapist, journalist, and creator of Ashira Active Meditation. She leads healing workshops worldwide, blending indigenous somatic therapy, Sufi wisdom and resistance. Her work centers on collective liberation, ancestral resilience, and decolonizing trauma healing. And I think a lot of us could do with some of your help. Maybe only speaking for myself. And also we have Emre Kazim. Emre has an extensive background in the governance of artificial intelligence and has published more than 30 peer-reviewed articles on the subject. And he's a senior honorary research fellow at UCL's Computer Science Department, where he completed his postdocs. And as you will hear, he's also a philosopher. That's where his PhD is, in philosophy. So please welcome our panel. And we were just chatting a little bit before in the green room, and we've kind of got a meta question for overall. This is not the question I'm asking all of the panel, but it's what we are trying to think about together, which is how can democracy win? How can the people win out in the context of the media, and data and platform information environment that we live in? So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Peter and ask you if you could reflect for us on the changes that have happened both within the media and with the integrity of public life within your career, and perhaps how that the changes have accelerated since you left the Telegraph 10 years ago. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And everybody can hear. This seems to work. I'm a complete imposter here. I started life in Fleet Street in my career in the 1980s. There was, we used typewriters. Copy boys would lift the carbons and take them, push them down a slide into the bottom of the building, where composters would build the paper, and then great trucks would come and pick up the papers and take them around Britain. It was quite that was how it was. It was a different world, and a world I understood. And I found computers, when we eventually moved on to computers, quite stressful. And we've now moved into a different world entirely. But what I thought was, which I understand even less, and on the way here, I read a tweet by somebody called Representative Jim McGovern. I should take him to be a Democrat. And it reads as follows. He put it up this afternoon. Let's review. X owned by Trump's largest donor. Facebook owner gave Trump $1 million. TikTok, soon operated by billionaire Trump donors. ABC fined Kimmel, gave Trump $15 million. CBS fired Colbert, gave Trump $16 million. This isn't normal. Free speech doesn't belong to billionaires. Now, that I thought was really about what it opens up the conversation today, because we live in a world where freedom of speech is owned by billionaires now, and that's what's been going on in the States. And if you look at the reception to Trump coming to this country last week, and you saw the front pages of national newspapers owned again by billionaires, saying that that Starmer has to learn the lessons which Trump is teaching him about the borders and about military action against migrants, etc. We realize that the media has gone. What the world we're in is in a very horrible place, and actually, the freedoms it's very easy to see that what is happening in America is coming across to our country, and will come across. And what occasionally you have conversations, you cheer me up, and because I was, before coming in to speak here, I sat next to Emery, who absolutely, he works at Queen Mary's here, knows about AI and this sort of thing. And I found it absolutely mind-boggling to have the new kind of, how should one say, information environment explained to me. I found it very exciting to have it explained. And I think the question, which leads me really to my final point, which is to respond to James's invitation to explain what is the meta question we might want to discuss this afternoon. And the meta question is, going back again to my idyllic younger career in Fleet Street, there were great writers on the left. Paul Foote, still lived in the ghosts of George Orwell. The Mirror was a great paper. The Guardian was still left wing, and so on. And there was you could express there was an element of free speech. The billionaire owners were still there. Now this is gone. And the question is how we can reclaim. I started off by thinking, left-wing discussions, because they're not possible. Really, there's very little places for them except in certain, certain fringe counter organizations. But really, it's how to reclaim democracy. The media is owned, not just the mainstream media. I used to work for the Telegraph, the Evening Standard, or the Spectator, etc. But also, as I read out there, the electronic media, the internet-based media, they are now owned by billionaires who control that discourse. And I think we have to work out, for the sake of the left, for the sake of democracy, and to head off a very dark future, how we reclaim freedom of speech. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Ashira, how does the media and the information system impact trauma, particularly for oppressed and occupied and colonized people? And also, could you reflect a bit on how the trauma that is suffered by people is now so present to us, but mediated through our phones and through these platforms? And perhaps discuss, is there a way that media, in the broadest sense, can contribute to collective healing or processing of trauma in a way which is productive?
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Peace to your kind hearts. First, before I talk about anything, I have to... Can you hear me? Okay. I have to say that when there's anything to talk about journalism, we have to start by saying that what kind of journalism in the world where we live in right now, where we have 245 Palestinian journalists being killed in Gaza. We have, only last week, Israel bombed Yemen, and no one has been talking about 31 Yemeni journalists who were killed and media workers in their offices for no reason. The situation that we live in is, since the genocide when it started in 1948, and the continuation and the escalation of the genocide that we have been seeing in the last 2 years, I think we have seen the true side of what journalism means for the West. And what it means is that journalism is something that I studied, and I believed wholeheartedly in the fact that when we do media so that we can serve the people and we can hold the authorities to account. But everything that I learned in the West, here in the UK, in university, was about the balance. And then working with the BBC, I saw that there's no such thing as a balance. The Palestinians claim, we always claim, we never state. Even if it's a Palestinian hospital, even if it's a Palestinian lawyer, they always claim. Whereas the Israelis always state, the IDF always states. The language, the way that we are seen in the media as not only Palestinians, but anyone who comes from the Southern Hemisphere, black and brown and Muslims around the world, are not seen equal, and they're not seen worthy of the same rights that people in the West have. And this is the balance of the Western media that they claim. And hence, of course, Peter, they're owned. And they pay millions to maintain this, because this is how they control the whole entire system of colonialism and imperialism. And in talking about trauma and what we have endured and what people are enduring around the world, it's also very much a systematic approach in how they traumatize the world. It's a crime against humanity, not because it touches one people. It touches humanity, and it changes the face of humanity forever. Everyone watching what's happening in Gaza is traumatized. Everyone scrolling is traumatized. Everyone who's suffered being a refugee, being black, brown, being oppressed, having dealt with racism, having dealt with war, their whole trauma has been reawakened by what is happening in Palestine. And it's done systematically, it's done in a manner that is studied, because they started very much, a lot of it happened also, we saw in the war in Iraq, and the desensitization process and the Islamophobia. And it was a plan that was originated by the Americans and by Israel. The whole propaganda machine that was going behind the scenes before 9 September 11 was from Israel, that if you take down Iraq. And they took down Iraq, and we were desensitized. We saw people getting hung. We saw American soldiers raping women. We saw the media report on it, and nobody moved. And millions of Iraqis died. And then it was just rolling and rolling. And the Palestinian genocide and the ethnic cleansing has been televised, but we've never seen it so close, so upfront, in your house, it's everywhere, and people are getting to see it, and the more you see it, the more desensitized you get to pain. And the way they work is, there's this whole they call us conspiracy theorists, the idea that they want to chip people and to have a society of robots. It doesn't mean that they want to put us into suits of robots or to actually implant a chip in our head. They don't need to do that. All they need to do is to ensure that people become desensitized to their humanity. You lose your humanity, and then you're automatically a consumerist machine that operates exactly as they want. You watch and buy what they want. You consume phones, you consume Macs, you consume HPs, knowing that children in Congo are being killed, women in Congo are being killed, and it's okay. You desensitize them there. And then you go on and you show them images of children being chopped, burned, scattered bits and pieces all over Gaza, and people continue to scroll, and they get to see the next joke and the next Tucker show. And it's a process of dehumanizing all of us and removing our humanity. And removing the veil of humanity means that your heart, somatically speaking, from a trauma perspective, your body knows that it's not right what you're seeing. Your body cannot accept when it sees other visuals of children being chopped. If you have children, if you have families, if you have a mother, if you have any human connection, seeing these images and being in close proximity to what is going on means that you dehumanize everyone around you slowly, and it happens in a process that we lose our humanity, and we continue living in a world where it's okay to burn, kill, maim, do whatever they want. And they're very much putting millions into their campaigns in order to do this. And we say that at least we have social media, because we don't have any access to the Western media. When I studied in Birzeit University journalism, we were supposed to be taught everything that the West teaches us, an American system. But I was a lucky student to be taught by Shireen Abu Aqle. Allah yarhamha, may her soul rest in peace. She was one of the most careful journalists in Palestine. And she used to tell us, don't listen to we would tell them that, but we have the press jackets. She's like, never trust them. The law does not protect you as Palestinian journalists. And she kept repeating that she didn't want us as students to go to the front lines because she knew that nothing protects us. And she ended up with a bullet in the head in front of the world witnessing it. And no one moved, even though she was a privilege to have an American passport. Miss Weaponized Barghouthi, one of our very strong teachers, was tortured in Palestinian prison and tortured in front of her child. There's nothing that the system operates in a way that continues to give us any hope, except for the fact that we are still witnessing people in their humanity. Emre was just mentioning to me how he's going to point about how much the Palestinian campaign has succeeded. And I remember sitting in a social media hub in Ramallah, And when the 2014 war happened, and what we can do, we planned on the streets protests. We planned everything that we can do. We got shot. We did everything that we can do as people. But also we understood that social media is a place where we are battling also for the humanity of others. And in that space, we won the campaigns. We won the hashtags. We were higher than the Israelis. And despite all the money they were paying, all the bots that they were buying, they failed. And they're failing again today because people are still refusing to lose their humanity. And the struggle for Palestine is not a struggle only for the Palestinians. It's a struggle for collective humanity to exist. And for that to happen, we keep
Sheila, thank you so much. Emre, I'm not even going to phrase it as a question. If you could give us a tight version of what you were explaining to Peter, things that perhaps the audience don't know about how they are receiving the information that they are, and the sorts of questions that perhaps we should be asking about how we can get some collective control over that.
Awesome, thank you so much. Hi everyone, I just want to say thanks also to Laura and yourself for organizing this event as well. I know how difficult it is to organize events and how, the amount of effort that's taken. So thank you very much for this invitation. It's almost impossible to say something after that, to be honest. So, forgive me for not being as kind of pronounced. But let me just start off actually by saying, you know what, when we say AI, it's a kind of, I notice almost every time I use the phrase, the first image that evokes in people's minds are like killer robots. And it's like, what the hell is AI? And there's been this kind of collective, let's say, communication regarding AI, where it's kind of, it's synced with robotics. So it's a kind of embodied intelligence in the form of some kind of Terminator. So let's kind of maybe take a step back and actually ask a more broader question about what do we mean by AI. So I'm just going to start by saying, when we say AI, we're talking about artificial intelligence, and what we're referring to are algorithms. An algorithm is just a way of saying, it's just a way in which you can just kind of come to a decision or a sequence of, let's say, events, statistical events, that give you results or produce results that would traditionally have been done by a human being. So what we had when we had the Industrial Revolution was we had automation of labor. And what we're seeing now with AI is automation of intellectual labor. So in the same way, we know just how dramatic industrialization was. So we got to think about AI as another kind of industrial revolution. But this time it's automating a different kind of labor, intellectual labor, more specifically. So the first thing I want to say is AI is here. Actually, and in a really kind of ironic way, even though we've seen just how dramatic the kind of impacts are, we're actually at an early stage. So it's actually very early in the AI game. So there isn't being the same kind of monopolization, even though it's emerging, as we've seen, say, for example, by the end of the 2010s with the social media platforms. So AI is still in a kind of, let's say, a formative phase. The technology innovations haven't finished. So still we're seeing lots and lots of innovations. It's almost like every other month or every other 6 months or so, there's a new kind of innovation. So the first point I really want to make here is that, yes, AI is here. Yes, it's a huge wave. I don't think it's unfair to describe it as an industrial revolution, but it's not being codified. It hasn't solidified. And actually we can think of it as an extremely open field that's still contentious, that can be used both by us and against us. So it's very important, I think, in this context, for me to say, I think it's important for us to understand that AI is here, but also to assert our own agency. So that was the kind of comment that I was making just before the panel, was to say the amount of, let's say, algorithmic manipulation that has taken place, let's say, in terms of removal of Palestinian content, images and voices and so on. But actually, at the same time, it has been overwhelmingly, in my opinion, the most successful communications campaign of all time. Like, despite all the dollars, we've just had a total inversion of the kind of public consciousness with respect to this particular issue, even if it's not translating into, let's say, the kind of political mainstream parties. But we know that there's a kind of time lag with these kinds of things. So there will be consequences. So that's the first thing I want to say. Secondly, I just want to take a step back and just say, what are the kind of ethical issues more broadly around AI? So the first one I want to talk about is transparency. So we have a question in AI, a very technical question, which is the problem of the black box, which is we don't know why or how. We don't know how these AIs are producing the kind of results that they're producing. They're black boxes to us. So we have these kind of different techniques. We call this the problem of explainability in AI. So it's still an issue of transparency. So if these systems are being used, so one example is when you apply for a loan, it's usually an AI that decides whether you get it or not. Increasingly, when you apply for a job and you upload your CV, it's an AI that's deciding whether or not you'll move through the process or not. So transparency is key for us to be able to make demands from any institution, which is, can you explain how these systems are being used? And how these systems are coming to the conclusions that they're coming to. Then there is transparency in terms of us being communicated to. So if you have a piece of content that you are reading or consuming, you should probably be made aware if it's been generated by AI. So that's been a massive amount. This issue of not just people talk about fake news, but also in terms of actual, just deep fakes. Images, videos, voices, words that are being produced by algorithms or AI, and you're just totally unaware of the fact that this is just being totally generated by an AI system. So it's very important that we assert transparency in terms of the impact of these systems on us. And then finally, transparency with respect to ownership. So who owns these things? Who's doing these things? Who's behind the mask, if you will? So that's one big area. Second area is the issue of fairness. So a lot of these systems are being used in a way that differentiate between particular demographic groups. So that's another major issue. So I'll just move maybe a little bit more quicker. Another issue is an issue of privacy. So it turns out that, so how many people have used ChatGPT? Maybe hands. So you know what, we've got, there's all these kind of, so the first thing is, it was probably trained on some data that we didn't concede to. So that's been a massive problem in terms of our privacy. Secondly, every time you kind of put in a question, why doesn't she love me? Or why isn't she, it's ingesting that kind of data. So companies are concerned about proprietary data, but I'm concerned as a citizen in terms of how much information does it have about me in some pretty kind of, very interesting and sensitive ways. So that's the second problem, it's an issue of privacy. So just generally speaking, this kind of confluence of, let's say, ethical issues culminates in political, in meaningful political questions. So the big question I would kind of throw back out, I think the question of our age is, what's the nature of the social contract in light of AI? So I'll ask one basic question, which is, I still believe in community. I think I wanted to come to this event in person. I know people are joining us online, but the material, the epithermal, if you will, matters. One does want to actually have solidarity and community by actually meeting people and spending time with people. Now, these technologies, they work, they allow for action at a distance. So Peter and I were laughing about the fact that we had a nationalist rally last week, and then they had a South African in America video calling and making some points about, how horrible it is that there's migrants and doing all sorts of evil apparently in the UK. So there was this kind of strange erosion of what we would have considered to be our jurisdiction, our space, our physical space, our digital space. So that's one major issue that we should all be kind of concerned about, and something that should matter. What is the nature of the social contract? Now, I want to talk about, if we're talking about media and AI, I want to think about media in terms of, we're actually talking about communication. And traditional forms of communication were mechanisms by which us as individuals would express our agency. So an individual would, let's say, for example, they're working in a factory, they would join a union, the union would express their political agency in X or Y way. You might even go to the church, the mosque, the community center, and so on and so forth. And somehow there was this strange kind of metaphysical transformation of the individual into the collective through an institution that represented their interests. Now what we're finding is every single person is this kind of digital denizen that's able to kind of do route one communication. Now, there is a positive consequence to that, which is voices that might have been excluded are no longer excluded. But there is a negative consequence to that as well, which is what happens to collectivity or the sense of solidarity when we have these kind of radical individuals? You know, what is the meaning for us in terms of our communicative strategy in that kind of context? And we've seen it, you know, over time, the way in which, let's say, traditional media was monopolized into the, and we talk about tech billionaire ownership, but actually what we do find sometimes, and I'm not talking about anyone individually, but sometimes now we're actually the emergence of the podcast megalomaniac. You know, that becomes a kind of monopolizes the voice or the opinion, if you will, of a particular kind of political or demographic group. So even there, we're seeing kind of, ironically, a kind of monopolization. And actually, it's individuals who are extremely effective at manipulating the algorithm that are able to do that. So we have questions in terms of political economy, our social contract, our communicative strategies. And I just want to end, and you know, just before going there, which is to reiterate that point about, I just find it extraordinary if you think about the amount of dollars that was spent and the amount of effort that was put in to suppress the Palestinian message. And yet, what is more, so, you know, this issue about our dehumanization, isn't there an irony, which is there was this attempt at dehumanizing, but actually it activated a huge amount of people. People that when we see Miss Rachel suddenly become some kind of political activist, you know, like just some, you know, middle of America auntie that's just like, hang on a minute, I feel so uncomfortable with this. Simply a Palestinian uploading an image has had this kind of consequence. So it's a contested space, it's an information war, but actually we have the ability as agents ourselves to kind of assert our will, if you will, and it's an open space. Awesome, thank you.
Thank you so much. And now to Amy Goodman, who makes the slogan "Free speech doesn't just belong to billionaires" true every day of the week at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. And Amy, would love to hear from you. I mean, the fact of your show offers us hope every day and gives an alternative, and the fact that you've sustained it for so long and influenced so many people. So I was hoping to just turn it over to you to talk about how we can build more institutions like Democracy Now!, how we can build a sustainer in the such a difficult information context, business models, all the rest of it, so challenging, how we can build more institutions like your own that offer both information and hope to so many.
Thank you, James, and what an honor it is to be on the panel with all of you. And I promise, folks, I am not a hologram. I'm so sorry I couldn't be with you in the room. There is so much to do. I've just returned from North Dakota, from the Turtle Mountain Reservation, home of the Chippewa Nation, where I sat with Leonard Peltier, meeting him for the first time, though I interviewed him for years, for decades, on the phone, whether he was in Leavenworth or whether he was in the prison in Coleman. He's a Native American leader who was imprisoned by the United States for a crime he says he did not commit during the shootout at Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota in 1975. He was imprisoned, held for more than 49 years until in the last hours, in the last minutes of President Biden's presidency, he commuted Leonard's sentence to home confinement. And so he returned to the reservation in northern North Dakota on the Canadian border. And for the first time in half a century, he celebrated his birthday, not quite as a free man, since he is still he is under the Bureau of Prisons control, but outside of prison. And what a moment it was. And I highlight this because we need a media that is independent, that is not brought to us by corporations, that is not brought to us by the government, but by the listeners, the viewers, the readers. so that we are free to bring you the voices of people at the grassroots. I really do believe that those who care about equality, about issues of war and peace, about environmental and racial justice, about LGBTQ issues, those who care about these issues are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take the media back. James talked about Democracy Now! For a moment at the beginning, but I really see this as a model. You know, we came out of an independent radio network, the We're Radio and TV, in the United States, the oldest independent radio network in our country. In 1949, Lou Hill, who was a war resister, put into a detention camp, came out of those camps after World War II and said, there's got to be a media outlet that's not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. The first station in Berkeley, KPFK, 1949, then KPFA in 49, 59, KPFK in Los Angeles. My station in New York, WBAI, went on the air in 1960. It was where James Baldwin debated Malcolm X over the effectiveness of nonviolent civil disobedience, among other things. WPFW in Washington and KPFT in the Petro Metro in Houston, Texas, went on the air in 1970. Within a few weeks of that Houston station going on the air, the Ku Klux Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it up. A few weeks later, when they rebuilt the transmitter, the Klan strapped 15 times the dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. I think it was in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant, which I actually think is a great song. But anyway, then it took months. And in January of 71, they rebuilt the transmitter and went on the air. I can't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops of the Ku Klux Klan, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. Why? Because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it is a Palestinian child, whether it is an Israeli grandmother who's protesting outside of Netanyahu's house, whether it is an uncle in Afghanistan, whether it is an aunt in Iraq, you may not agree with everything you hear, but it makes it much less likely that you'll want to destroy them. Because when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, it breaks down the caricatures, it breaks down the stereotypes that people have. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it is wielded as a weapon of war. And that's why we have to take the media back. I think about the networks, not only Fox News in the United States, NBC, CBS, CNN, all of them bring you this small circle of pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. There is nothing more powerful than hearing someone speak for themselves or telling their stories until they can tell their own. Just 2 days ago on Democracy Now!, we highlighted the latest Al Jazeera documentary on the disappearance of Dr. Abu Safia, the head of the Kamel Adwan hospital in Gaza, who was taken by the Israeli military, that incredibly famous photograph of him walking through the rubble in his white coat, climbing through it as he was called by the Israeli soldiers. and now disappeared, now imprisoned. In that case, though we can play clips of Dr. Abu Safiya when he was sending out messages, please, to the world. At this point, we have to talk to directors and doctors that knew him and the patients that were treated by him. But it is critical that we have a media that is free to do this. And we mourn the hundreds of Palestinian journalists that have been killed over the last almost 2 years. And the networks do not say often enough, if ever, that international journalists are not allowed into Gaza, and the hundreds of Palestinian journalists that have been killed trying to tell their own stories, the stories of their people. Not to mention the hundreds of healthcare workers, etc. It is absolutely critical. We continue to highlight this absolute horrific assault and bring out the voices. One human rights group, Amnesty International, we were just speaking with the Secretary General, Agnès Calamard, who came out many months ago talking about Israel's assault on Gaza as a genocide, something Palestinians have been saying from the beginning. The hunger of the population, the starvation of the children, the grandpas and grandmothers and the parents right now. This has to be front and center every day, especially in our countries, in the US, in Britain, in the countries that are providing the weapons to allow this to continue. And to highlight this every day. It's our responsibility. And yet we have right now, if you're following US news, and of course US news merged with British news this week with President Trump coming to London for his second royal visit, his first with the Queen, now with the King. And what is essential for media is to bring out the voices of people on the ground. The mass protests in London and around Britain, the mass protests in the United States. It's our job to make dissent commonplace because that makes people safe. As President Trump just said yesterday, that criticism of the Trump administration is illegal, is breaking the law. Now, how does that affect the media? You may have heard in the last few days about Jimmy Kimmel being offed by ABC. How is this an example of the concentration, the corporatization of the media? You know, the newsrooms are a tiny part after Reagan deregulated the media, and it continued through Democratic and Republican administrations. Fewer and fewer corporations owning more and more of the media. Now we see the absolute results, the fruits of this. You have Jimmy Kimmel on ABC. ABC had already paid Donald Trump something like $15 million to settle a lawsuit that almost all experts, legal experts, said, of course ABC would have won. It had to do with one of the news hosts, George Stephanopoulos, saying that President Trump was found civilly liable for rape. In fact, he was found civilly liable for sexual abuse, sexual assault, and the judge said, in common parlance, that is known as rape. So that was first, ABC paying off Donald Trump to the tune of millions of dollars. And then you have the FCC threatening ABC for Jimmy Kimmel's comments. President Trump has long said after CBS said they were ending their contract with Stephen Colbert, another comic, President Trump cannot stand being mocked. CBS had paid off the Trump administration something like $15 million because Trump said he didn't like the way CBS's leading news show, 60 Minutes, had edited an interview with Kamala Harris Again, the legal experts said he couldn't win this. But instead, CBS paid off Trump. Why? Because CBS, which is owned by Paramount, was making a deal with Skydance, which was owned by Trump allies Larry Ellison and run by David Ellison, his son. And they didn't want the merger that had to be approved by the Trump administration to be denied. And so it was a small price to pay. Of course, the larger price is free speech, because when the largest corporations are taken down, it is much easier to go after all of us. But ultimately, I think independent media is the only answer, not brought to us by governments and corporations, but by the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you to all of our panel. I will move soon to questions, so if you've got questions and you're watching online, please put them in the chat. But I'm going to abuse my position to ask everyone a question, which is sort of on behalf of all of us, as Amy put it, the silenced majority. In the face of the targeted killing, the endless targeted killing of Palestinian journalists, also Yemeni journalists, Iranian journalists, and so on. Of course, there's some in the National Union of Journalists who have campaigned and protested about this, but broadly speaking, the journalists are not doing the job of solidarity with their fellow journalists, and in fact, in some cases, it's much worse. I found a really quite shocking experience during Israel's bombing of Iran back in June. I was on a breakfast TV show, and I had gone on in order to challenge the newsreader to say, not the newsreader, the news presenter, what did you feel when you saw the footage of the Iranian newsreader as their offices were bombed while they were live on air? As a journalist, as someone who does the same job, sitting in the same seat, what did you feel? And he said, nothing. I hate this argument that we should feel something. It's a legitimate target. They're a mouthpiece. And of course, that's an extreme end of the spectrum, but we hear very, very little from the supposedly normal end of the spectrum. So my question for all of the panel is what can we all do as part of the silenced majority in standing up for those journalists who are being systematically targeted for trying to bring us the truth in context of war? Don't mind who would like to go first.
Thank you. This is not working, is it? No.
Have a go of this.
Yes, that one works. I think it's, the journalists in the West have failed us completely. I was talking to a friend of mine about the situation and what we can do, because we still have journalists on the ground and we need to find ways to protect them in the West Bank and in Gaza. And also, it's not only journalists. As Amy said, it's bringing the voices of the people. And we have Bisan, who has been in Gaza, reporting every single day and getting the news out. There's so many people who have become journalists, forced into covering their lives, and they all require protection. But specifically the journalists, I think there has to be pressure on the syndicates. There has to be pressure on the union, journalist unions, to either boycott Israeli media, boycott the IDF spokesperson, people coming out and speaking. As a journalist in Palestine, when I was working to cover Israeli news, people don't understand that in Israel the censorship is not a joke. Once you arrive into the country as a foreign journalist, or if you are holding an Israeli government press card, you are dined and wined by the Israeli government. And everything that you say and do is recorded by the Israeli government. And journalists find it very easy to go and sit in hotels in Tel Aviv and cover what's happening in Gaza from there, while they get reports from the Israeli IDF office. And they don't do any journalism. They just sit and they receive the information from the IDF. If you say anything contrary to what the IDF's media censor releases, then you will lose some of your privileges. And it starts with losing the weekly free wine and dine in Tel Aviv. It's a very surreal situation that is not normal in terms of how the propaganda machine operates in the country. And if you dare break it for any local or international journalist who comes. But there's a lot of pressure that should be also from the public, the UK, the BBC. I don't know what can be done. Protests. I know that there's hundreds of protests for years in front of the BBC. There has to be a way to push them in a way to move, to stop covering the IDF. For example, to stop receiving reporting on IDF spokesperson statements as a punishment to the Israeli government for killing their colleagues. There has to be a way.
I so agree with what you're saying. I've had colleagues, Middle East Eye, where I write a column. They've been killed. Lubna Massawa, our bureau chief, the last words with Aziz was, almost her last words. He said, she was talking to him, please write about a Palestinian journalist who's been killed, he'd been killed. And he said, what are you going to write about me when I'm killed? And she changed the subject, and then he was killed. And he was targeted in a double tap. Look, there's several things we have to do. One is, we have to cover the deaths of the journalists. There's absolutely shocking statistic produced by the Centre for Media Monitoring that the BBC has covered 6% of the slaughter of journalists, 6% of them. Now, that's shocking. That is, BBC is a news organisation. And basically, it's ignored the vast majority of the death of journalists. We also ought to call out the way, again and again, Israel has put a target on the back of journalists. They say they're Hamas. They have no evidence. They've never produced this evidence. I just want to try a thought experiment here. If Putin had done this in Ukraine, absolute outrage from the Western media if he was doing the same thing, naming Ukrainian journalists as activists for the Ukrainian government, and there would be a reaction. There would be a boycotting of the spokesman. Well, yeah, I think this is, look, there are more than 200 of our colleagues, the bravest of the brave, who with immense courage and sacrifice have gone through hell to tell the truth about what's been happening. And they've been slaughtered by Israel, very often targeted. And the reaction of Western journalists, we still allow Israeli spokesmen, they're given a very soft time. Look at the Israeli ambassador in London the other day, just leaving with sort of a claim. And you should see the article, the interview with her in the Times newspaper shortly before she left. It was beyond belief. And of course, we mustn't, Israel has lied and lied and lied again. It's been caught out endlessly telling falsehoods. And yet still the BBC will say about the Gaza Health Authority, this is Hamas run, but they never challenge. The Israeli spokesman has lied. This chap is completely untrustworthy. They fabricate. I think that's one other thing. And I think you have to look at boycotting. I am afraid this is the stage we've reduced. We must now enter. There's been a complete double-sidedness, unfortunately, about the way this the slaughter of Gaza has been reported.
So just to add a little bit, I think one of the best pro-Palestinian spokespeople are the Israeli spokespeople. They just so badly undermine themselves. So I remember right at the start of the war, when I think it was Shifa, the hospital got bombed, and then there was like BBC Verify, and then it was saying, maybe they bombed themselves. And I remember having this conversation with a friend of mine who's not political. And I said, do you believe they bombed themselves? Like, do you think it's possible that they bombed themselves? They bombed their own hospital. Like from some, so there is a sense in which, and I feel like this is what's happened over the last few years, it's kind of taken, there's a lot of, and I think that undermining of traditional media, because it's been so servile. It's been so brain dead, to be honest, that, the talking points, the best lie is the one closest to the truth. And these things are so outrageous that, and it works both ways, the left and the right. So it's undermined, the media, the central media has been so undermined by the Palestinian coverage that it has undermined it in some sense. So, not to add anything more, but other than to say, actually what's happened is there has been a significant undermining of traditional media because of this.
Amy? Tech sorts out that while the principle of boycotting the spokespeople I like a lot, having had a run-in with myself with David Mensa and seen his work, I think every moment he's on television, the better, because he is so incredibly ludicrous. But that doesn't change the fundamental point that the Israeli official position is presented as if it's factual and everything else is a claim. Amy, do we have you?
Well, first I just want to say how important it is to show the level of dissent on the ground. I mean, in the United States, as the Trump administration tries to, they're attacking every major institution in the United States, the universities, the law firms, taking billions of dollars away from scientific research, saying that universities like Harvard and Columbia are anti-Semitic. When you show the level of protest on the ground, the encampments that were built on college campuses around the country, many of the students were Jewish. In fact, not in spite of their Jewish education, but because of their Jewish education. But the corporate media they would sometimes show pictures, but they wouldn't go there and talk to the students. And of course, there were so many Palestinian students, Arab students, international students. Democracy Now! Followed closely Mahmoud Khalil, who was the Columbia graduate student who was imprisoned in an ICE jail in Louisiana for months. We were there at Newark Airport when he came back, beautifully against the backdrop, which none of the media pointed out, of a mural welcoming international visitors to the United States. And now just this week, an immigration judge in Louisiana ruled that he should be deported to Algeria or Syria. But okay, that's what's happening. But the level of protest around the country must be expressed. Even Congress members across the country who have received AIPAC funding, American Israel Political Action Committee, millions of dollars, have now started to reject that money and one after another are calling for an arms embargo against Israel. These are just facts. The level of support of Israel right now in the United States is at an all-time low. You wouldn't know that if you watch the media. And that's why we have to build our own, of course, not only in the United States. And Democracy Now! Is just a program, an hour program daily, but we air on community television and radio, public television and radio stations across the country. And we have to shore all of them up to ensure these, what are really sanctuaries of dissent, because dissent is what's going to save us. You know, years ago, in 1999, my colleague Jeremy Scahill, who started at Democracy Now! And now runs Dropsite News, we won an award from the Overseas Press Club for our documentary Drilling and Killing, Chevron and Nigeria's Oil Dictatorship. Nigeria, the most populous African country, and they were moving into the Niger Delta, killing they were bringing in the Nigerian military and killing protesters. So we got this award, and I'm telling you this to tell you the story of the ceremony when we got it. We go to a major hotel in New York. Hundreds of journalists are there. This is a big deal. And when we got to the ballroom where they were giving out the awards to journalists, we saw that Richard Holbrooke was the keynote speaker. And when he got up, this was in the Clinton administration, he announced to this gathering of hundreds of journalists that NATO forces had just bombed radio television Serbia in Belgrade. He announced to the applause of many in the audience that NATO had just bombed RTS. As we came back to our newsroom that night, we saw they were pulling out the body parts of the beauticians, of the camera people who were in the building at the time. Since this was happening, and this gathering of journalists, Jeremy went up to Holbrooke as he was speaking and said, "Sir, I want to ask you a question." He was brought out by security. They didn't quite understand we were the award winners. So when they announced our award, Jeremy was already taken out by security. So I went up on the stage and I said, "I want to say thank you so much, but no thank you." Because when we tried to ask Richard Holbrooke before the award ceremony a question, given what was happening in Yugoslavia, he said he wasn't going to answer. Maybe he'd talk to us later. But what most disturbed us is the head of the Overseas Press Club came over and said, "What are you doing?" And we said, "We're asking Mr. Holbrooke a question." They said, "No, we agreed we wouldn't." So I got up and I said, here we are. We can't accept this award because Jeremy's just been taken out by security. And the audience applauded when Richard Holbrooke announced that the journalists' building in Serbia had just been bombed, and that this organization made a deal with the speaker, who is a key player in the war in Yugoslavia, not to ask him questions. So thank you, but no thank you. I think it was, I can't remember the top journalist who was there. I think it was Tom Brokaw. As I stepped down off the stage, said, "Thank goodness for the First Amendment for freedom of the press." And that is true. We have to thank the principle in this country that is enshrined in the United States: freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, which is why we have to do everything to protect it all. Freedom of assembly is to cover those who assemble and protest, as they have in the last days outside ABC and Disney, against the corporatization of the media, as they've protested for years now around Gaza. It's critical that our microphone is there. Not let the pundits describe, let people tell their own story.
Okay, now we're going to open it up for questions. Can I see some hands? We'll take groups of 3 questions together. Let's do so it's easy to go up. 1, 2, 3. Start there. Then the lady at the back with her hand up, and then the one in front.
Hi. I wanted to ask you, Emery, to expand on a point that you made at the beginning about AI. And I really totally agree with your framing of it as a kind of industrial revolution, like 4.0. I've written about this before as well. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about, what lessons we as a people can take from like previous iterations of industrial revolutions, not necessarily people who work in media, but like as media consumers, or even outside of media where AI is also being integrated into more and more of the labour market. What kind of power do we as people have? And what lessons can we take from examples from, the 18th century revolutions onwards?
Thank you. And then if you just pass the mic just to the guy in front.
Thank you very much. We've discussed a lot about like US media organizations and the fact that they've got these sort of billionaire owners. And I know that in the UK we don't have that as much. Obviously the BBC is meant to be a public institution. However, one of the most, I think, the largest bit of censorship that we've seen in terms of the Gaza war was the pulling of the documentary. I think it was a few months ago now. But a lot of that came from a lot of very, very powerful voices that pressured the BBC into doing this. Now, I would hope that public opinion would be very much forcing this, because it's one of the first times that we'd seen a lot of the images in Gaza and some of the, awful stuff live on our big screens on the BBC. And the fact that this was pulled really indicates that there's a lot of pressure that we can't see from very powerful voices in the UK. And I suppose what I'm trying to ask is, what can we do as communities in the UK specifically to make sure that there isn't this kind of this kind of malignant control over our media, a media that is meant to be publicly owned? Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And then this gentleman here. Thanks.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Amazing. Okay. Now, okay. Thank you. When I think of the how the media runs here in the UK and the influence, I think of the duels between the BBC and Reform, for example, and how the unbalanced coverage compared to other political parties, and also you have Tommy Robinson and the relation with Elon Musk, that it's also giving a very powerful message and influence over everyone in the country. However, you see also what Zohran Mamdani did in New York, while Elon was on the opposite side and everyone was mobilizing, but he was able to succeed. However, here, the left is still not able to follow the lesson learned from the history and even Zohran Mamdani's campaign in order to play to our strengths and somehow be able to influence people from the right, the working class of the right, in order to bring them over. So do you think, I think maybe the question to James, but do you think the current political party will be able to move in that direction?
Thank you. Emery, do you want to start with the one that was for you?
Thanks, it's a great question. It's a really good question, actually, in terms of what do we learn from the previous industrial revolutions. So the first thing I'd say is that there are we talk about that in terms of there's a symmetry between this and that. Then we can also talk about the asymmetries and why it makes a big difference. So the first one is that traditionally when you had general purpose technologies, they say electricity or steam engine or whatever, the internet even. Actually, a lot of these things, they came from quite centralized places. Then it kind of bled into, so let's say the internet, it started with its military, went to industry, then it came to citizens. So one of the big asymmetries that we're seeing now with AI is that actually the biggest users of AI are citizens. It's just general citizens, people on their laptops, on their computers. So there's a big difference between that and what was taking place in the other, let's say, other kind of more, I'm using digital example here. And I think that makes a huge difference. So what was interesting in traditional industrialization is that there was something called the Engels pause. So it took about 50 years of industrialization before we started to see kind of, let's say, capital that was being transferred from, capital that was being invested into knowledge rather than production. Whereas what we're seeing now with AI is it's going straight into production. So it means basically that there's a very, very low barrier to entry for people to actually get involved in AI. So I think what we should think very seriously, is about actually owning this space. So there's a lot of young people that are way better. It's a kind of funny cat and mouse where you've got a huge kind of industry and government agencies, and then you've got just some people online, or you've got people just kind of mocking up these or using these technologies. So the barrier to entry is very low in this industrial revolution. So it actually makes it way more radical. So I think it's actually going to be a lot more open than one anticipates it. So I would assert, if you will, is that sometimes on the left, there could be a kind of fetish of critique, you know? But actually we should really assert ourselves and think about and empower people to actually use these technologies and think about how can we actually use these in really interesting, not just subversive, but really kind of ways in which we can express our agency.
Peter, can I ask you to respond to the question about how we can more effectively challenge the BBC from the outside?
Yes, can I just, there's a very, do you reckon, when that program was pulled, Ben Duper, after the producer, who then eventually got it into Channel 4, wrote the most astonishing, really a historic document, giving the account of his dealings with the BBC. And I do recommend it. It was in The Observer. And there were two special things, quite extraordinary. When you make a documentary, which I've made quite a few, you have to put every claim, allegation, etc. you're making, every statement, at great length to the people you criticize. And they got back 15 pages from Israel, presumably the IDF, but and it was endless links. And there were two. There was one general point which the Ben Duper makes in this article. The one was that the BBC didn't regard Amnesty International or the United Nations as a sort of respectable organizations. They said, we can't trust Amnesty. Now, the reason for that, of course, is that Israel was saying that. Israel was saying to the BBC, you can't trust the UN and you can't trust Amnesty. And the BBC editorial people, this is shocking, were putting the Israel's line to Ben Duper about the program which it was planning to publish and eventually didn't publish. And the second point, which is even more shocking, quite astonishing, is that the Israelis provided a link in order to rebut one of the points being made by the program, to a doctor giving testimony that he'd been very well treated, that the program was wrong. This doctor was inside, and I'm talking from memory here, but he was in prison. It is thought that he was under duress. He'd been tortured, and the BBC was trying to persuade the program makers to publish material in favor of Israel, produced under torture. Now, that is, of course, against the Geneva Conventions. It's a war crime. And I think the BBC just got itself... do read this. This is my memory of the piece, but I may have got the odd detail wrong, but I'm sure I've got the basic facts correct. Now, the BBC had allowed itself to be captured by the sort of IDF version of events. It didn't it was presenting quite weird stuff, immoral stuff on behalf of Israel,
to journalists of astonishing, integrity and professionalism, and I think it really has to sort it. Well, just briefly, I want to say the BBC in many ways has done some fantastic stuff in the past. I've supported this. I think I prefer it to, to these billionaire, but it's lost its way. It's allowed itself to be terrified by certain lobbies, and it did produce that wonderful Theroux program from the West Bank. But so it has done some good stuff, and I think generally Jeremy Bowen and Liz Doucette, etc., do a reasonable job. They're hardened professional people who understand the situation. But some of it, the rest of its reporting, particularly in London, has been frightful.
So, I think one thing that needs to be done is to investigate the BBC and to investigate Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and all these organizations. At the head of the editorial team in the BBC, each and every single one of them supports and defends Israel, not because they're convinced of or scared, but because they have interests. And I think somebody needs to get into this. I've been to the meeting. As a journalist, I followed somebody and I went into one of the meetings and I understood why all of our stories were blocked from Palestine. And there's amount of scrutiny and the amount of patriarchy and the amount of white supremacy that sits on the big editorial table is horrific. One way to battle them, I think, is to expose each and every single one, their personal interest. It's a public broadcaster. Their names are out there. It takes one journalist to go in and do the work and to show exactly what there is. And even within Amnesty, as somebody who worked within Amnesty, we suffered because at any of these international organizations, you have Israeli intelligence working within the institutions. You have them operating. Myanmar were sitting next to me in one desk, and we were crying dying in the procedures of how we as researchers would get to call Israel an apartheid state and to get the research on apartheid accepted, whereas next to us, the Myanmar team took them about 1 week to get genocide in Myanmar. And it drove me crazy. And I told them when it comes to genocide, it's going to do the same. And if you ask my colleagues, the Palestinian colleagues, once they leave their position currently in Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, they will be speaking about what has been done to them in order to silence them, even from these most supposedly liberal organizations. There needs to be scrutiny at all these places and exposure of these links that have been suppressing our voices.
There's been one investigative piece I know by Owen Jones for Dropsite about the BBC's Middle East desk, which I think would be worth people having a look at. Okay, some more questions, but we're going to have to be incredibly short because we're already over time. And there was the lady here at the front. Here. Yes, this lady here in the front row.
Thank you very much. I think together with the film last night, which was raised so many other questions, and I'm so glad to have you here today as well. That's fantastic. I just think it's been a fantastic afternoon, but I think one of the things we're not looking at is the historic failure of the media, both the visual and the written media, against state violence, challenging state violence against legitimate protest. And those of us who are active, it is a real problem now about how to be active and how to actually work. And I just want to mention the miners' strike. I know that makes me feel very ancient, but it was hugely important. The Battle of Orgreave, at which the BBC turned the whole question round, and they misled with the image of it, and they called it a camera error. It was not a camera error about Orgreave, and the organisation for Orgreave is still trying to get justice for people. We've got Hillsborough, but now what we've got is we've got a failure of the media on protest against legitimate protests and against Palestine action, and also it's going to be against the flotilla as well. So I just want us to sort of look at how we can really challenge state violence and the use of police by our government against people who are protesting legitimately and properly.
Thank you very much. The gentleman here with the bucket hat. Oh.
That's me. Hi. So my name's John. Just want to say it's been a brilliant day. So thank you, Jeremy, for organising and the team that did that. My question is, within the media environment with AI developing, how do we ensure that future generations have the imagination to imagine a different future to the one that we're heading towards at the moment? I think it's really important that we use the stories that we've heard today in order to give them something different from what AI that I see in my work, what it's designed to do. It's designed to make you not really think and just do what you're told to. So my question to the panel is, how do we give future generations that imagination through media and your work? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, last question here.
Hiya. It's more an observation, really. I've heard a lot of people today say we need to bring the working class on board. I just want to say there are the working class people of this country. I'm from a working class background. I'm not anymore. I'm a teacher and I tick a lot of middle class boxes now. But the working class in this country has a long history of protests against the far right, and the working class people are not a homogenous group. And I know lots of people are lorry drivers, shop workers, nurses, and all those kinds of things. And drunken people urinating in the street and shouting abuse like they were last weekend do not represent any of those people that aren't. And certainly, I think, credit to working class people who are standing up and part of the protest movement.
Thank you. Okay, so to wrap up, I'm going to give each of our panelists just a minute or two to respond to the questions, and each, if you could finish, which is responding to one of the questions which is online, which is, can you leave us with one action or principle to guide us in engaging with the media and the information more generally that moves towards advancing our collective humanity, not dehumanizing us? So those questions, and pick whichever question you want to respond to, and we'll come along.
I'll give it to you because I need something.
Okay. Oh yeah. I'm actually quite moved by that comment. I think it's just such an important point. Let me tell you about the shift. So I did a PhD in philosophy. Philosophy department was about as bourgeois as it comes. And then I ended up in computer science, and I saw everybody was critiquing tech and AI, but actually it was way more interesting. Like sociologically, it wasn't a personification of the class structure, if you will. It's a lot more radical. So I think, and honestly, I've been trying to kind of seed this as we've been talking, I think we've got phenomenal opportunity. I think that in terms of the young people, we're way better, if I'm young anymore, we're way better at communicating than the hundreds of millions of brain dead money that's going into these propaganda machines. I feel like we're way more on the bleeding edge of the technology. And actually, there's a huge amount of opportunity here. This isn't the end of the Industrial Revolution, it's the beginning. So I'm super confident. The country is teeming with talent, up and down. There's a low barrier to entry with these digital technologies. So I'm actually extremely optimistic and hopeful.
No, I really agree with what you've just said. It's partly, when I do meet, I'm quite old now, younger people, they're very exciting. And what you were saying about the working class, I mean, there are decent voices, and I think the majority of people are decent. But what we are being taught to hate each other. There's a project to make us hate each other. And one thing, I think it should be a great campaigning thing for the left, for anybody actually, anyone who can. We cannot have foreign owners of media, British media. We cannot have owners of British media who don't pay their taxes. And we've got to have proper monopoly. That takes out Murdoch. It takes out Rothermere. You know, you've got to have a stake in this country. You can't just have to live it. And I think if you can just do those simple things, as well as your very encouraging point, actually, that the new media which will emerge is much more easy to access, and maybe these old, broken, foul, oligarchical media instruments which sell their papers by making us hate each other and hate other people. The sooner they go, the better.
I have a very new a child who's 4 years old, Lyra, who's been jumping around here. And she's been jumping at me when I talk to ChatGPT because she thinks it's there's somebody inside. And then when I explained to her, she was like, okay, so I can just talk to him and ask him questions. And she's been expanding ChatGPT's creativity and asking about the fairies and where they come from and if they were real and what happens to them, and then if they're not from there, then where do they come? And I've seen how ChatGPT hits walls. And then and she's so smart that when they don't know how to answer, she asks another question to make it think again. And the same girl who's following the flotilla at every single step and making sure that every day she wakes up and she's like, did they get there? Did they get there? Did they get the food to Gaza? Is the food coming to Gaza or not? I think the generation that's coming is a very strong and powerful generation. And I think with the tools that we have, with the AI versus traditional media, I think is, I don't believe too much. I have zero faith in the switch until there is I think people are waking up even in the conservative parties in the US to dominance and the dehumanization that's happening to them. And I think they will be flushing out the old media and it will be pushed out of the way. And yeah, we just need to keep moving and to keep in action and if you want to support Palestinian journalists, elevate their voices, tell their stories. Follow Mariam Barghouti from the West Bank. She's the only journalist who's still able to go around into Jenin and speak about what's happening because they've terrorized the rest of the Palestinian journalists. Sending and sharing the stories of Palestinian journalists and raising their voices, talking to them, pushing the media to have conversations with them. Also showing films, project the film on the screen, on the building of the BBC. If the BBC doesn't want to screen the film, take action and do things individually, and every action makes a difference.
Amy, the last word with you.
That's a big one. Yes, every action, to echo your point, every action makes an enormous difference. February, Democracy Now! Celebrates its 30th anniversary. 30 years. We started to be just a 9-month project, and then people asked for more. 9 stations ran us, radio stations, and now we're at 1,500 public television radio stations around the world, headlines in Spanish, and this week we passed, 3 million subscribers on YouTube. It's really important that people support their local independent media. By the way, a shout out to Resonance FM in London, and also build your own media as we connect all over the world. And I hope people will send story ideas to stories@democracynow.org or through social media. It's critical. When you talk about Mariam Barghouti, we have her Democracy Now! Sitting in that studio in Ramallah. She is telling us, she shares her narrative, how important it is for her to frame the story. But I wanted to end by remembering the White Rose Collective, because I think it's a message to all of us, especially in the media. That group of German students, Hans and Sophie Scholl. Hans was a medical student at the University of Munich, and his sister Sophie was an undergrad. And with their professors and other students, they realized, I mean, they weren't Jewish, they were German Christians. They thought it is critical that Germany never be able to say the German population we didn't know. And so they made thousands of pamphlets. They would release them in alleyways, at marketplaces. They dropped them over the atrium of their school so that everyone would see. I think on the fourth of the 6 pamphlets, it said, "We will not be silent." So Hans and Sophie and their professor were caught by the Germans. They were charged, tried, convicted, and beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic Oath of the media today, the Hippocratic Oath of us all today. We will not be silent. Democracy now.
With that, thank you very much to our panel, our fantastic panel who heard from today. Let's have another round of applause for them, please. So now to round off the day, there's 2 of our speakers who weren't able to come, but they've recorded a video in conversation with Jeremy, which is now going to seamlessly appear above my head now. That was pretty good.
Action. Thanks so much for being here. I know you can't be at our conference tomorrow. We're here at the PJP offices. We're going through austerity 2.0. Once again, cuts. Once again, closures. Once again, job losses. And we're told it's all for the good of the national economy. We were told that last time. We were told that the time before. We were told that the time before that as well. What's the alternative?
Well, job losses and cuts are never the answer, because really the economy is built by the many, not by one. And a lot of the things that we need to do to help people, they say, but where do you find the money? And that's why it was so important to me as a labor leader doing this work and fighting against austerity and all the hurt that that created, when I met Stephanie and learned about her work and about the question of where does money come from. So it's really a freeing notion. And so Stephanie, give your elevator pitch.
My elevator pitch.
On where does money come from?
You know, it's ironic in so many ways, because there are so many problems that need to be solved. And the easiest thing in the world to do is to create the money to make everything else move forward, to mobilize the resources, to put people to work, to rebuild the NHS, to take care of our communities, to repair the damage we've done to our planet. Austerity is a suicide pact. And the people who think that the thing that you have to come up with first is the money to start solving the problems have the horse and the cart completely backwards. You have to figure out where it is you want to go, set the missions, be bold and aspirational, and understand that we're not on a gold standard anymore. Nobody has to go dig things out of the ground in order to find the money that we need to pay to start solving the problems. Finding the money is the easiest part of the whole problem. The challenges we face are big, and it takes a lot of work to think about how to start solving them, how to use our people and our technology.
With that voiceover, you could make the test card seem interesting on the television. Well done, you. Actually, the discussion that Stephanie and Sarah had was very interesting. If there's any way we can recover it, we can possibly show it tomorrow, because they were talking about union organisation, class structures, Marxist analysis of it, and how they have organised in the unions to achieve an awful lot of change in the USA. Both had to return at very short notice to the USA, so they very kindly came into the office yesterday and we recorded that video, but unfortunately the sound obviously hasn't worked, so we'll have a look at that if we can do anything. We meet again tomorrow morning at 10. This evening we've got the party on at the George, isn't it? Yeah. George just round the corner. Please come along to that. I think today has been an absolutely fascinating day with some wonderful speakers, wonderful information. I've been in for nearly all of most of the sessions, and actually I feel sort of overwhelmed with information and ideas, which is not a bad place to be at the end of a day. And so I want to say thank you to all those that have taken part today. Our point is about global issues of peace and war. It is about the crucial issues of environmental sustainability. And I think the last session we've just had on the media is absolutely central to the whole thing, because increasingly over-concentration of the media into very dodgy hands, I think you have to say, which means that we don't actually get the right to know. And the way in which the Israeli forces have deliberately targeted journalists in Gaza and also in the West Bank, and indeed they've been targeted in other conflicts, but this is unprecedented, the volume of it on this occasion. And so it's sometimes on left organisations, people sort of round on journalists and media and so on. I don't. What I do is round on the ownership and the attempts to control. But what I do is also salute those very brave journalists who say what they think, but also make sure that what other people think is heard and known about. So let's hear it for real journalists who've laid down their lives. So again, as I said earlier, I was very keen on the Peace and Justice Project doing something big and special next year, or over the next year, on education, schools, competition, and with that, of course, comes teaching of history and the way young people's opinions are formed. I think we can do a good job on that. So any ideas people have got, please bring them forward. And we will be producing a report from the Gaza Tribunal in the very near future. We had a bit of a conversation about it at lunchtime today, getting the final report together, and that will be then presented to the British government and to Parliament because of the complicity of Britain with genocide in Gaza, and that is absolutely a key part of what we're doing. Tomorrow is about social issues, is about housing, is about health, is about social care. And I think it's going to be an absolutely fascinating day. So see you in a few minutes at the reception at the pub that we've organised. And thank you, Sam, for doing that. And thank all the volunteers for everything they've done today, because they've worked really hard. So let's hear it for the volunteers. And see you all for coffee at 9:30 in the morning. Thank you very much.
Well, then we can share it online because